Coming up on this episode, Steph Curry's contract extension, what it means for the Warriors, and the other three pieces of contract business that Golden State need to attend to over the remainder of the offseason. Welcome back to the Golden State with Mates podcast. I am up and about. This episode probably won't be published for another 8 hours or so early Saturday morning US time, but I've just finished watching Alexei Popyrin take out Novak Djokovic in the third round of the US Open. As far as enjoyable Grand Slam tennis matches go from an Australian perspective, that one was right up there. And Novak was off his game, no doubt. His serving was woeful. I don't know what the double full count was in the end, but his serving was horrific. I don't think there was any injury or anything like that. Maybe just some tiredness from a long year, obviously, but full credit to Alexei. You know, one of the biggest upsets in recent history of Australian tennis. I look back at what I've kind of witnessed throughout my lifetime, particularly the last 10 years, I suppose. You go back to Nick Kyrgios beating Rafa at Wimbledon when he was 18. John Millman beat Roger at the US Open, I think in the third round or the fourth round in 2018. There's a couple there, but this one from Alexei, who it's not just the fact that he's beaten Novak in this game, but it's the rate of improvement that we've seen from him over the course of this year, of course, becoming the first Australian male in over 20 years to win an ATP Masters 1000 event. So it's been a lean time for Australia in terms of men's tennis. Of course, Ash Barty in the women's before she retired won a couple of slams, and that was great. But in men's tennis, it's been a long time coming. And in Alexei and Alex de Minaur, there's a couple of players there that are now inside the top 30. Alex has seeded 10 here at the US Open. So it's an exciting time, and I'm up and about because, my goodness, he played well, and he's got the weapons, Alexei, to hopefully go further in this tournament with his big serve and big forehand. But anyway, let's get on to Warriors basketball. The huge news obviously coming yesterday of Stephen Curry's contract extension, a 1-year, $62.6 million deal for the 2026-27 season. So he's now under contract for another 3 years. That will take him through to the age of 39. It's great for the Warriors, particularly after an off-season where we've been speaking so much about Steph's future, right, about the Warriors' future, whether or not they're doing enough to prioritise his prime, whether he's going to remain content at the franchise after missing the playoffs last season and after missing out on the likes of Larry Markin and Paul George this off-season. So it reiterates that Steph is committed, that Steph has faith in the franchise. And that's not to say that things won't change or can't change from this position. He's clearly got this desire to end his career as a one-franchise player, which is fantastic, and this contract extension reiterates that. But the Warriors are still under some pressure, right? It probably alleviates the pressure somewhat, getting that extra year on his deal. But they're still under pressure to go out there and put a winning team, a winning organisation around Steph. And if they can't do that, who's to say things won't change and that Steph won't look elsewhere in the potential of a trade request? And this is certainly not a scenario where the Warriors should just be relaxing now and thinking, okay, we took care of Steph, we got an extra year, let's chill out now. No, they still need to go hammer and tong. This is just, again, as Brian Windhorst said on First Take earlier today, it's a reiteration that Steph is confident in the direction that the Warriors are heading and that there's still success around the corner. But again, they can't rest on their laurels now. They need to go even harder after getting this commitment from Steph to try and put a winning team around him. And we'll wait and see how that goes over the course of next season. Of course, starting in just over a month now with the preseason matches, and then of course their opening game against the Portland Trail Blazers in late October. I do want to just, one thing that irked me a little bit, and I want to defend the franchise a little bit here in terms of some of the public narrative that's going around this offseason, and even more so again in the wake of this Steph extension. So I'm a big fan of Stephen A. Smith. I find him hugely entertaining. Some of his takes some of his takes I agree with, some of them I disagree with. Some of them can just be blatantly wrong sometimes, and I found his some of his sentiment after this Steph extension on First Take earlier today, I found it wrong. So this is one of the quotes that he had as part of a pretty long dialogue, being critical of the Warriors' inability to get a second star since KD left for the Brooklyn Nets in the 2019 offseason. So Stephen A said, "Why in the hell can you not get somebody worth noting to come play with this brother?" Talking about Curry. "You would think people would clamour to do so. I don't know if that has been the case." Now, he did mention Paul George, but he questioned why the Warriors weren't able to get Paul George. And here's my issue, is that either Stephen A isn't well informed enough or he has a short memory. Because I don't think you can be critical. You can be critical of the Warriors' inability to complete a trade for a secondary offensive star like a Paul George or a Larry Markkinen. But I think the whole Paul George situation told us that, hey, the Warriors do have the capacity to still lure players to come and play for them and to play alongside Steph. Paul George literally went on his podcast and said that a deal was close and that if it were to go down, he would have been really excited, and he called it dope if it were to happen. Now, obviously it didn't, and he ends up signing and walking to the Philadelphia 76ers in free agency. But that was not a case of the Warriors' inability to lure a star to the Bay. It was a case of the LA Clippers not wanting to play ball, and understandably so. They did not want to take on the salary of Chris Paul, Andrew Wiggins, whoever it may have been to get to the salary matching of PG's. I think if you'd opted in, it was like a $48.8 million contract for next season, whatever it was. The Clippers, whether rightly or wrongly, there's certainly an argument to be made that it was an understandable decision to say, no, hey, we'd rather let PG walk in free agency and get nothing for him than have to pay all this money again next season and be in, deep into the luxury tax again. So I could understand their thinking from that perspective, but from this kind of narrative that the Warriors can't attract anyone to play alongside Steph, they had Paul George. Paul George wanted to come to Golden State. They were ready to give him a 4-year, $220 million contract extension. It was all ready to go, except the Clippers, to their prerogative, decided they didn't want to do it. And so again, if you're Stephen A or anyone else, you can criticize the inability to complete a deal for a star talent. But I don't think you can necessarily be critical of the inability to attract someone there. It wasn't a case of the Warriors wanted to trade for Paul George and Paul George said, no, don't trade for me. I'm not opting in if that's the case. I'm just going to leave and go in for entry. It was Paul George wanting to come, wanting to play alongside Steph Curry, wanting to play alongside Draymond Green, wanting to play alongside a young talent like Jonathan Kuminga, right? And so I still think the Warriors are an attractive destination for players moving forward, and practically because of Steph Curry, because he is the most unselfish superstar that we've ever seen, and he's so good at incorporating other players, other star level players, as we saw with KD, into the system, taking a step back if necessary from that. And so going forward here, we've obviously got to see whether or not the Warriors can eventually attract that star level talent. But again, it's more so about their ability to actually complete a deal rather than it is to go and actually get someone to come. It's more about completing a trade with another team. And as I have said multiple times on this podcast, I do not think teams want to help the Warriors out. And so that's the thing that I go back to Stephen A, is that, it's not about the player, it's about the opposing team. And when you are a team like the Warriors, who've had the league's highest payroll for the years on end, obviously you cannot attract anyone, a big name, in free agency. It has to be via trade. Therefore, another team has to be willing to essentially help you to complete a trade. I do not think teams want to help the Warriors get a 5th championship. They do not want to help Steph Curry, right? The Warriors have been the most successful team in the NBA across the past decade, 4 championships. Another team doesn't want to be the reason why that dynasty continues. I think the Clippers were part of that, and not only the whole Warriors dynasty factor, but also just being a Pacific rival, having a reasonable rivalry between the two teams. Why would the Clippers have wanted to help the Warriors out by giving them Paul George for a below market price, because the Warriors were never going to give huge value to PG for PG when there was the threat of him walking to another team in free agency anyway. So again, it's not about the player not wanting to come to the Warriors. It's about the rival teams not wanting to complete a trade, not wanting to help the Warriors. And that's what I want to try and stress to Stephen A and anyone else, is that I don't think the Warriors have necessarily lost their attraction completely. Now, yes, they are much less desirable than what they were a few years ago. There's no doubt about that. If you look at where they finished last season, 10th in the Western Conference, their championship window isn't necessarily wide open anymore. There's no doubt about that. So, yeah, they're less desirable than what they once were. I'm not arguing against that. But to say that they've got no capacity to lure a star-level player, I think is wrong, right? And for Stephen A to question why they weren't able to get Paul George, the answer is obvious. It's that the Clippers didn't want to do a trade. And if the Clippers don't want to do a trade, which is up to them, then there's not much the Warriors can do about it. So I don't know what else needs to be said on that topic. But I was just really disappointed with Stephen A's comments, because they were either ill-informed or he's got a very short memory with not recalling why Paul George didn't go to the Warriors. But anyway, I love Stephen A. I think he's hugely entertaining. I agree with most of his takes. Listen to him all the time. He's in a position that I and many other people would love to be in. Like, you look up to him as like he's the dream of being able to talk sports on a daily basis and get paid millions and millions of dollars to do so. It's an unbelievable job. I'm so envious of Stephen A. Smith. But it's not, doesn't mean I'm going to agree with everything he says. And this one I think he was completely off the mark. Anyway, before we move on from that, I just want to just mention a quote that Steph had in The Athletic today when he was talking about his extension. He said, "It's good to get the extension question out of the way and give complete focus to basketball and to the season." So it's interesting, that quote, because I think Steph has seen over the past couple of seasons an issue with these contract discussions and them getting in the way of, as he said in this quote, being able to completely focus on basketball and to the season. We saw Clay last season, ongoing storyline throughout the entirety of last season. Will Clay leave the Warriors as he eventually did? Will he get an extension? What value will he get on that extension? All these different things that came into a big storyline. And there's no doubt that impacted Clay's ability on the floor last season, where he was a negative for the Warriors in terms of on-off-court numbers and stuff like that. And then if you look at the year before that, we obviously had Jordan Poole, Andrew Wiggins getting extensions after the championship in that offseason, but then Draymond Green not getting one. And yes, Draymond ended up re-signing starter free agency, but I still think that was a massive storyline, right? And he, whether completely true or not, he had some eyes elsewhere in terms of looking at going to the Memphis Grizzlies in free agency. So that was obviously a storyline as well. And the last thing you want to do is have another season, the third straight year, where there's another contract issue that is a huge storyline outside of just basketball. And I think the Warriors, as it is, there's always going to be trade speculation and stuff like that on the Warriors. But in terms of individual player contract discussions, you don't want that to be a storyline, as Steph says. And I think he's seen the impact of how it impacted the team and how it impacted Clay individually last season. And even before that with Draymond and the whole discussion of obviously him not getting a contract, but Jordan Poole getting a contract after the whole training camp incident in 2022. So good that Steph was able to get this out of the way. And it's interesting because he still had another 2 years to run. It's not as if this was necessarily going to be a huge storyline this season. It was more so next season, I think. If Steph was entering next season on expiring and he hadn't extended yet, then we start thinking, oh, okay, now this is a massive storyline if he can be a free agent in 2026. So, he obviously doesn't want that to be a distraction in any way, shape or form. So now we turn our attention to what else the Warriors have to do this offseason in terms of player contracts. And the big one here number one now with Steph, with his signature secured, is Jonathan Kuminga. Right, extension eligible heading into his fourth year, making $7.6 million on the final year of his rookie deal. Plenty of speculation already on what he could get or what he wants, what his team and management wants. Yahoo Sports' Jake Fisher reported a few weeks ago now, that Kuminga and his team are looking for the full max, which would be 5 years, $224 million, the same as Cade Cunningham, Evan Mobley, Franz Wagner. These types. So I don't think the Warriors are going to be offering that, but I do think there's a middle ground to be found where it's still something that's very significant and still more than what even his play over the second half of last season would suggest, but does take into account the future potential that Jonathan Kuminga undoubtedly has and his importance to the franchise. Like, Jonathan Kuminga, I still think is, like, right now, I think Jonathan Kuminga is the second most important player on the Golden State Warriors. I think Steph is clearly number one. He's always going to be. But I think Kuminga is more important than even Draymond, right? Because I think Draymond, we kind of know what he's going to provide for the Warriors next season, so long as he doesn't do any of the extracurricular stuff and get himself suspended or anything like that. I still think Draymond's an excellent defensive player, one of the best in the league, really high-quality player still, and I still expect that to remain. But in terms of the Warriors' chances for next season, they really hinge on how good Jonathan Kuminga can be, how good Brandon Podziemski can be. And I still think Kuminga is probably more important to the Warriors right now in terms of their chances for next season than Podziemski's, because the Warriors' number one void right now is a secondary offensive star for Steph. And Kuminga's the one guy on the roster who could foreseeably build into that role and become a guy that averages more than 20 points, perhaps closer to 25 points a game. So he's the second most important player on the Warriors. And if I was his team, I'd be going into contract discussions with Mike Dunleavy Jr. And the rest of the Warriors front office and reminding them of that. Like, you need this guy desperately, not only on your team, but obviously to deliver and fulfill on his potential. And so I would think that, and I've said this previously, I think 5 years, 160 is about the mark. That's kind of about the Jordan Poole money. And again, I've said this previously, where I think Jordan Poole was a more proven player when he got that extension than what Kuminga is right now. But I think Kuminga has a higher upside, and he probably also has a higher floor in terms of being able to impact the game in a multitude of ways, having the upside of he could be a really strong wing defender in this league for years to come. Jordan Poole is never going to be a good defender, right? So there's one negative all of a sudden. Kuminga, the shooting needs to come along, but outside of that, he's got a game that should allow him to be, at the very least, a high-level role player in this league, and we've already seen the stuff of him being a potential all-star with his ability getting to the rim with that combination of skill and just unbelievable athleticism. So I think he's got higher upside than JP, and he's probably got a higher floor than JP, which means the contract won't necessarily become a complete albatross, horrific one for the franchise like it did with Poole, to the point where the Warriors moved on from him even before the contract started. So I would start at about there. I think that would be, 5 year 160, which is the same as 4 year 128 essentially. So that's about where I'd sit it at the moment. And if JK doesn't want to take that, then he can risk it. And good luck to him. Hopefully he has a season. Let's all hope that he has a season that automatically makes him a max level guy as a restricted free agent next offseason, and that the Warriors straight away as a restricted free agent are like, yep, here you go. Here's the 5 years, 224. Like, that would be ideal. That'd be a great scenario. But doing that right now is a little bit risky for a guy who still hasn't shown as much as some of those other guys that have got those deals this offseason. Moses Moody is the other one, obviously extension eligible as well. He's really interesting because, like JK, the Warriors have inhibited themselves a little bit by not fully gauging what these guys are yet, and they've still got the potential without necessarily seeing the output at this stage. And that is largely the Warriors and Steve Kerr's fault for giving Kuminga and Moody such inconsistent opportunity throughout their first 3 years. ESPN's Kendra Andrews a few weeks ago stated that a deal for Moody could range between $11 and $13 million. I think that'd be a steal for the Warriors if they can get Moody on that kind of number. You do it. I think if it's 3 years, but 3 years between $30 and $40 million, I think that's fantastic for the franchise. I see very little downside in that. The high point I'd probably be willing to go to is about $15 million a year, whether it's 3 year 45, 4 year 60, anything more than that. And that's where you're kind of risking paying too much for a guy who might not even be in the rotation. And I think we all expect that, if Moody does stick around, that he will eventually be in the rotation and be, 20 to 25 minute per game guy at the very least. But I wouldn't necessarily be locking in more than $15 million a year at this stage. Again, if I'm Moses, I could understand him turning that down because you think that you could get closer to $20 million if you have a really strong fourth year and then you enter restricted free agency. And in a similar vein to Kuminga, you bet on yourself to get more money in a year's time. That's perfectly reasonable. And again, that would be a great outcome for the Warriors, even though they're obviously having to spend more money. If they can get these two guys to the point where they're really worth that money, then great, fantastic. But if Moses is willing to take something 3 years between 30 and 40, you lock that in because that could turn into a really, really, really team-friendly contract over the next few years. And again, with the Kuminga Moody stuff, it's all about balancing the output that we've seen so far with the future potential, and that is difficult. And part of that difficulty is because the Warriors haven't played those two guys as much as fans probably would have liked over their first 3 seasons. The last piece of contract stuff that the Warriors need to figure out is Quinton Post. 52nd overall pick, obviously, in June's NBA draft, and we haven't really heard anything. There hasn't been any confirmation of him being on a two-way spot yet. I think that's the most likely scenario with him taking Reece Beekman's spot, but it's super fascinating that that hasn't been the case yet. And they could do it up until basically the start of the season. There's no rush on this thing, but it is weird that it's taken so long and we haven't heard anything about it. Now, does that, while the market and stuff was going on, I always had the theory that, maybe they're waiting because they think that they're going to make a 2-for-1, 3-for-1 trade and that they'll open up roster spots and financial flexibility to be able to give Quinton Post a guaranteed contract. That was my theory. It obviously hasn't eventuated just yet. Didn't eventuate with the market and stuff. Maybe that is still a possibility, and that's why they're waiting on it. They think that there could be a 2-for-1, 3-for-1 trade coming where they need to fill out the remainder of the roster. They have the financial flexibility to do so. Of course, the Warriors right now, they do have a vacant roster spot, but they're $533,000 below the first tax apron where they're hard capped at. So they cannot sign a free agent, essentially, they cannot sign Quinton Post. They cannot sign anyone, essentially, to that 15th roster spot right now. The only way of opening up that possibility is waiving Guy Santos and then signing someone else to the 14th roster spot. As I spoke about on last episode with Bruno Caboclo, who was working out with the Warriors, but unsurprisingly has decided to take up a deal overseas in Israel. Don't blame him for that, getting a guaranteed, I think he's getting $1.5 million deal or something overseas, rather than taking a risk that was probably unlikely to come to fruition with the Warriors given their roster situation. So, Quinton Post, the most likely outcome I see is him just taking Reece Beekman's spot on the two-way deal and the two-way contracts to start next season being him, Pat Spencer, and Daquan Plowden. That's my expectation, and maybe we'll just have to wait for training camp for that to materialize. It'd be weird for the Warriors not to have Post on either a two-way contract. I suppose they could put him to Santa Cruz and just say, have a year in the G League, and maybe they bring him up at some point. Who knows? I think that's likely to happen anyway, but I would still suspect that he'll be on the roster in some form, whether it's a main roster or more likely as a two-way spot. But we'll wait and see. There's still some contractual situations. And yes, that is, compared to the Kuminga, Moody, and the Steph stuff that's already happened, yes, that seems like a lower priority right now. But if you look at last offseason and getting Trace Jackson-Davis to sign a 4-year deal at like less than $7 million, that is now, is that the best value contract outside? Because I think Steph is still the best value contract on the Warriors roster. He is, because of, what he means, how important he is to the team first and foremost, but also just the marketability of Steph. So I always think like he's always the best value contract on the roster. But outside of that, obviously you got JK for another season on a rookie deal. Pods as well is on a great deal, but TJD, getting him as the 57th overall pick on a 4-year, $6.9 million contract, whatever it was, that is just unbelievable value. And if they were to create a roster spot to be able to give a guaranteed deal for Quinton Post, and they did something similar where it was the same money, 4 years, $7 million, first 2 years guaranteed, third and fourth year team options, then that could equally turn into one of the Warriors' best contracts if Quinton Post, as a 24-year-old, can come out and show that he can be a rotation player from, doesn't have to be next season, but from his second year, and you've still got him under contract for another, 3 years after his rookie year. Like, this stuff means something. This, especially when yes, we're talking about the end of the roster right now, 14th, 15th spots, but TJD now is could be a starter, could arguably be a starter next season. And if he's not, then you'd expect him to be in the top 7 in minutes in the rotation in terms of minutes played. And so, yes, we're talking about minor stuff right now, but this minor stuff can turn into major stuff depending on how the player develops. So that's the three orders of business that the Warriors still have to undertake this offseason. Extensions for JK and Moody as 1 and 2, and then Quinton Post, what they do there as number 3 as well. But thank you very much for listening to this episode of the podcast. Let me know what you would do with JK, Moody, Quinton Post. Let me know what you think of the Steph extension and what it could mean for Golden State moving forward. If you've got any other thoughts on the offseason or whatever, then please feel free to comment in the YouTube section. If you haven't subscribed already, that would be greatly appreciated. You can follow me at POC252. That's POK252 on X/Twitter, and I'll see you on the next episode.